Okay, so we're going to read pages 57 to 62. Sorry, the dog just decided to shake. We're going to read pages 57 to 62, and we're going to actually look at how the Burlings and Gerald react after the inspector leaves. So if you remember, he's given that very, very long speech. He's used dramatic irony to talk to them about the wars. He's warned them about being members of one body, as in a community only works if you take care of everyone. He's done all of these things to warn them and to make them change their ways, and now we have to see whether they do that. So do they change their ways? Eric starts drinking straight away, and Burling says angrily to Eric, "You're the one I blame for this." Now, straight away there, we've got Mr. Burling not taking any responsibility, which is the exact opposite of what the inspector said. The inspector was talking about collective responsibility, and collective responsibility means that everyone takes responsibility for their actions, everyone realises that they're in the wrong, and everyone decides to actively make a change. However, that's not what's happening. Mr. Burling blames Eric for all of this. And that then shows that Mr. Burling is not willing to make a change. Now, again, the older generation this whole time have been very set in their ways. They've been very corrupting to the younger generation. You know, Eric feels like he's got no one to turn to. Sheila learns from her dad how to use her power and her wealth to hurt other people. And we just kind of end up in this cycle. And we sort of hope now that if the older generation can't change, because they didn't, we know they didn't. World War I happened because Priestley blamed them, but World War I happened, World War II happened, and they're who Priestley blamed for World War I and World War II. Because remember that quote that I set you on the slides before? It's about the fact that you know, old men start wars that young men have to fight. So what we're seeing here again is this sort of massive problem where Priestley's not necessarily blaming Mr. Burling for the war. He's blaming all the men that are like Mr. Burling, who didn't mind sending young men off to be slaughtered in World War I. So again, it's really interesting that that's Mr. Burling's first reaction. It is Priestley saying, look, these men weren't going to change, but the younger generation can. And Eric actually just says, I'll bet I am. I bet. And, you know, you don't realise yet all you've done, is what Mr. Burling replies with. Now, make sure you've read these pages, 57 to 62. But that's what Mr. Burling replies with. You don't realise all you've done. Now, if you actually have a look at why that's quite ironic and why that's also very hypocritical. Now, we always want to refer to Mr. Burling as a bit of a hypocrite, because he'll say one thing, but then he'll do something else. You know, he'll say he's a respectable man, but then he'll do something that's not respectable. You know, being an unfair employer, that's not something that you would respect. So he talks here about the fact that you don't realise all you've done, but actually the whole way through I didn't realise what he's done and how he's harmed this girl. And then he starts again talking about a public scandal. Now, it gets to a point where it's sort of like, a girl is dead. Stop caring about your reputation. But Mr. Burling doesn't. He keeps worrying about his reputation. So he's not worried about anything else that's happened. He's worrying about how this is going to look to the public. Again, meaning that Mr. Burling has not learnt to be a better person. And Eric actually says, I don't care now. I don't care. So we can see there where actually Eric is perhaps better than his father. And Eric's sort of, you know, paternal instincts were perhaps kicking in because he realised that he's lost his child, so nothing else really matters. And again, you know, Eric's done something horrible and something absolutely horrendous. And in this day and age, it wouldn't necessarily be called rape, but it was at the time. And to then talk about the fact that he's taking responsibility for it and he's willing to accept a punishment. You know, I don't care if there's a public scandal. I don't care what's going on. I don't care what happens to me. At least we know that he's able to repent. So to repent means to regret what you've done and to try and make amends for it. And that's all you can ask when someone does something wrong. You know, apart from not doing it wrong in the first place, which he should never have done, but at least he's repenting. Whereas Mr. Burling doesn't show any signs of repentance. He just sort of shows signs of blaming other people and trying to worry about his status and his reputation still. And then he mentions the honours list. I was almost certain for a knighthood I was going to be on the honours list, again with just getting that idea that it's about status for him. And Eric laughs rather hysterically. Now, I love that adverb, hysterically. It kind of shows just how ridiculous his father's reaction is. And I want you to annotate that. I want you to zoom in on that word, that when after the inspector leaves and Mr. Burling talks about his reputation, Eric laughs hysterically at him because and points at him, and he laughs because it's the most ridiculous thing in the world. Oh, for God's sake, what does it matter? So again, Eric has gone from being very, very quiet, very uncomfortable around his parents, to now actually just sticking up for them because he's realised that they're wrong. And what Mr. Burling then talks about is how he's going to repay the stolen money. So what's ironic here, and I want you to write this down, what's very ironic here is that Mr. Burling believes that he is owed something by Eric. He feels like he is hard done by. He feels like he deserves money, but he was unwilling to give the money to his employees. Which actually makes it quite interesting that Mr. Burling is talking about the fact that he is owed something, but he is very stingy with other people. He doesn't actually give other people what they deserve. You know, he's very selfish. And he talks to Eric about repaying this debt, which again shows that he cares about getting his money back. He cares about profit more than his children. His son has just found out that his child is dead, and he's talking to him about repaying money. Where are your priorities, Mr. Burling? Are you a good parent? I don't think so. And he talks about, no more of this drinking and picking up women. And it's almost like Mr. Burling's trying to become a father now, but it's a bit too little too late, isn't it? And Mrs. Burling says, I'm absolutely ashamed of you. But Eric says, I don't blame you. Which is interesting here, because Eric is then implying that he is ashamed of himself, and that's what we can infer from that. But he also says, I'm ashamed of you too. So look at where Eric is happy to share the blame out, just like Sheila was happy to share the blame out, wasn't she? So again, it's showing that they're actually a lot more similar than we thought they were, and the inspector has influenced them to take responsibility for their own actions, but also to share the responsibility with the other people who were responsible for Eva's death. You remember that metaphor of the chain of events. At any point, one of them could have broken the chain and it wouldn't have carried on, and Eva wouldn't have killed herself, but they all chose equally to not break the chain and to therefore hurt Eva. So it became a big issue. And Mr. Burling tells him to drop that because they have excuses. Now, that word excuse, I think, is really an interesting way to talk about it there. If you've done something wrong, but you make an excuse for doing something wrong, that means that you haven't actually fully admitted that you've done something wrong. You think you were justified in doing it. And he said it's unfortunate, that it turned out unfortunately, that's all. Now, if you look at those two words, that's all, it's very dismissive in its tone. And tone's really important here in characters and the way they speak in plays. And I don't mean tone as in how they actually speak, because that's not English literature, that's drama. But when we talk about the words that's all, it belittles it. So that is all. It gives it an end. It gives it a finite, that's it, that's all I'm talking about. And I find that really interesting that Mr. Burling's desperate to sort of almost move off the topic of conversation there. That's all, let's get rid of it. And Sheila repeats it scornfully. Now, these adverbs are great to actually talk about. The fact that she's full of scorn actually suggests that she hates her parents, that she has some hatred for them, or their belief system at the very least. And I find that really interesting here, that she's repeating it back to them. And Mr. Burling actually basically tells her to be quiet, which is, again, a way for him to infantilise her, to belittle her. And Sheila says, I behaved badly. I know I did. So I'm taking responsibility. I'm ashamed of myself. But now you're beginning all over again to pretend that nothing much has happened. And what she's saying is, so much has happened, but you are so set in your ways that you're returning to where you were. You haven't learned anything. You haven't allowed yourself to grow as a person. And Burling actually says nothing much has happened, which again has that dismissive tone, and it's an exclamative sentence with an exclamation mark at the end to really show that Mr. Burling is so shocked that this seems to have affected them so much, because he doesn't think it's anything important. And then he goes back to that public scandal. Again, the repetition here is crazy. This phrase keeps being repeated. Public scandal, be a public scandal. No one cares about a public scandal. It's only Mr. Burling that he cares about, and Mrs. Burling. And who here will suffer from that more than I will? Now, it's really interesting here that Mr. Burling talks about his own suffering, and the inspector went to great lengths in the play to talk to us about how Eva died a horrible, painful death. So again, it gives us a bit of perspective here. Is Mr. Burling a good person, or does he have absolutely no perspective? He's very selfish. And Sheila says, I don't care about that. You haven't learned anything. And that's the important part here. The inspector comes in as a socialist to teach them something. Now, what's interesting is a lot of people sort of believe that maybe, and I'll get onto this in a later video, but perhaps the inspector is like almost the voice of Priestley, coming in to say you need to learn, otherwise bad things will happen. Well, this is Priestley's way of saying, of course bad things happened in 1914, and of course they happened again. Of course there was World War II, because these people weren't learning. And Mr. Burling actually says that he's learned plenty, but actually what it is that he's just learnt about his family. So again, their relationships are very strained here. And Eric said, do you remember what you said to Gerald and me after dinner when you were feeling so pleased with yourself? You told us a man has to make his own way, look after himself and mind his own business. That we shouldn't listen to people when they say everyone needs to look after everyone else. Like we're all mixed up in this together. Now, what Eric is drawing attention to is the direct contrast between one of Mr. Burling's first speeches and the inspector's last speech, and how the inspector is very much saying we are all responsible for each other, but Mr. Burling at the start was saying we absolutely are not. Now, over the course of the play, who have we seen is correct? Who has Priestley made us see is correct? The inspector. Because Mr. Burling was mixed up in this lower class girl's life, even though she was a different class to him. So again, what's being proven here is that the inspector is correct. And it's really interesting here that Sheila talks about, is that when he came in right after Father said that? So she almost thinks it's quite convenient here that he's here to change her dad's mind just after he's talked about the fact that there's no one, just after he's talked about the fact that we're not all mixed up in this together. And she says it's very strange, very queer. And Sheila says it doesn't matter much now, of course, but was he really a police inspector? So Sheila's starting to almost think perhaps he wasn't a police inspector, perhaps he was something more. And we'll talk about the theories and everything later in another video. But Mr. Burling actually says it matters a devil of a lot, makes all the difference if he wasn't a police inspector. And Sheila says no, it doesn't. It doesn't to me, because what we did was still wrong. Even if he was or was not a police officer, he still pointed out that we all did horrible things. And Sheila says that she's going to go, and we're on page 59 now. She actually says that she's going to go, but then she gives a whole speech. You turned the girl out of one job and I turned her out of another. Gerald kept her at a time when she was supposed to be too busy to see me, so Gerald's done something bad to me. Eric, well, we know what Eric did, and Mother hardened her heart and gave her the final push and finished her. What Sheila is doing is she is referring to that metaphor of the chain of events. Any one of us could have broken it. So we can see here where Sheila's happy to take collective responsibility, but no one else seems to. So she's saying it doesn't matter whether he was a real police inspector or not. What matters is we all did those things. We are all responsible for what we did. And you know, Sheila says that she vaguely all along had this idea that there was something more to this. It wasn't just a police inspector. And Mrs. Burling talks about why she felt he wasn't a police inspector. She says he was so rude and assertive. Now, I like the fact that she describes him with that adjective, assertive, almost like he's not allowed to be in charge, which again very much shows that the upper classes thought that they should be the only ones in charge here. And Burling brings up his status near the end again. I was next Lord Mayor and a magistrate and so forth. And it's really interesting here that he again sort of status drops. He talks about his status here. But Eric actually says, no, Sheila's right, it doesn't make a difference. Whether he was a police inspector or not, we all did terrible things. But see, what we're coming to the conclusion of here is that Mr. Burling only thinks that he should care if there's a consequence. If something's going to affect him, he cares. If it affects someone else, he doesn't. And that's what's happening here, isn't it? You know, if necessary, like, he can't do anything to your mother and Sheila and me except perhaps make us look a bit ashamed of ourselves in public. We're on page 60. But as for you, he can ruin you, you know. And Sheila actually says, we hardly ever told him anything he didn't know. Did you notice that? And I find that really, really interesting, that Sheila says that he already knew everything, you know. And we'll talk about why that's important later. You know, Burling says he made a few smart guesses, you know, and Sheila talks, you know, but he made us confess. You can talk about that now, like you think you could outsmart him now, but you didn't outsmart him at the time. You know, he's made us admit to what we've done wrong. But Mrs. Burling again puts herself above others. Oh, he certainly didn't make me confess, as you call it. I told him quite plainly that I thought I had done no more than my duty. And Sheila says, oh, mother, because she's getting sick of it. She is getting sick of Mrs. Burling, because Mrs. Burling is consistently pushing the blame away. And, you know, Burling talks about the fact that the inspector was prejudiced from the start. Probably a socialist or some sort of crank. And I find it again very interesting that he calls Mr. Burling prejudiced. He calls the inspector prejudiced, but Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling have proven that they've been prejudiced the whole way through. So that's quite interesting. And Eric says, well, I didn't notice you standing up to him. Like, you're now stood here and you're now telling us all the things you would have done, but you didn't do any of those at the time. Again, show Mr. Burling to be quite cowardly, to be quite interested in status and how he looks to other people, even if it's not the truth, because it's not the truth that he would have stuck up for himself, because he didn't. And, you know, Mrs. Burling says at the very end of that page 60, really from the way you children talk, you might be wanting to help him instead of us. Now, I find that interesting again, because she's sort of trying to talk about an us and them, and Sheila has told her specifically, do not do that. The inspector has told them specifically, we all live as members of one body. So it's really interesting that that Mrs. Burling's still trying to separate them. And then they go straight back to, I'll ask Edna to make us some tea. They go straight back to their normal lives, don't they? Now, Gerald does come back in at this point in time. Now, what's really important is Gerald goes away because Gerald wants some time to think. And Gerald, before he leaves, says that he understands Sheila. Now, remember, we're thinking about generations here. So the older generation are very stuck in their ways, and they believe what they believe, and they're not changing their mind. The younger generation are more likely to change their mind. They're more likely to understand what's going on in the world, according to Priestley, because they're the ones that have to live with the consequences of the actions of the older generation. Now, Gerald is in the middle. He understood Sheila when he left, which means he has the choice here. He can join Sheila, or he can join Mr. Burling. And if he joins Sheila, he's made a change. You know, he started to behave like Sheila and Eric. He started to make a change. He started to actually acknowledge what he's done wrong. Or he can go for Mr. Burling, and he won't be acknowledging that at all. What does he do? Well, he starts talking about the fact that he doesn't think the inspector was a police inspector. So we get up to page 62. you know, I met a police sergeant down the road. I told him. He swore there wasn't an Inspector Gall or anything like him. And what Gerald is trying to do here is he's trying to push blame away. So just exactly what Sheila has already said. This is not about whether he was a police inspector or not. This is about what we did, and what we did was wrong. But again, Gerald has made his choice. He's joined Mr. Burling, and he has decided that if there are no consequences for his actions, he will not care, and he will not change his ways. So yes, his action was the nicest to Eva, but he doesn't see any problems with the way the rest of them behave towards Eva. So therefore, is Gerald better than any of them, really? Because to me that sounds actually like he's just desperate not to make a change here. And he actually makes the phone call. So he makes the phone call to the hospital to see what's going on, to see if a girl has come in. And so in that respect, Gerald is the one who is trying to make the excuses now. And so Gerald's almost picked a side, and I think he's picked the older generation. So he's basically saying we can stay set in our ways as long as there's not a real consequence. Okay, so we'll leave it there. That's on page 62. Don't forget to do the slide that is going up online as well.